Just after sunrise, the desert air over the Black Mesa Training Range shimmered with heat that hadn't even fully arrived yet. A long stretch of ochre sand, jagged ridgelines, and distant rust-colored cliffs formed a horizon that looked endless. The range was quiet except for the low hum of generators and the soft murmur of soldiers preparing for what had already become an embarrassing morning. 12 elite marksmen had cycled through the long-range platform. 12 had tried. 12 had failed. The target, a steel plate set 4,000 meters away across broken terrain and rippling heat distortion, mocked them all from its unbothered silence. Even the instructors, usually loud and full of swagger, had grown quieter as each attempt missed wide or evaporated into the desert wind. Standing at the back of the gathered group was him, a broad-shouldered Navy SEAL operator whose presence was more felt than heard. His name, unknown to most outside his team, was Ross Calder. Early 40s, built like he'd been carved out of the same stone as the desert cliffs, veins running like raised cords down his forearms. He rarely spoke, not because he was arrogant, but because he'd learned long ago that the loudest men on a range were rarely the deadliest. Ross was the kind of man people forgot about when scanning a crowd until they looked twice. And that morning, as the instructors argued about wind drift, humidity, barrel temperature, and a dozen other variables, Ross watched quietly. His arms crossed over his chest. A frustrated voice snapped through the dry air. "This is ridiculous. No one can make that shot. No one," another soldier muttered. "We should scrap it. It's impossible." Ross's gaze remained on the target, unblinking. Before he could even step forward, though, the commanding officer barked out his version of motivation. "We've burned half the morning on this," the colonel growled. "0 hits. Does anyone else want to waste our time?" Silence. The kind of silence that loves crowds. Tight, uncomfortable, full of fear of being noticed. Ross exhaled slowly. He knew the moment was coming. He felt it rising like heat off the sand. He shifted one step forward. "Before I tell you what happened next, subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It helps more than you know." Then he looked toward the instructors again, expression unreadable. Someone laughed under their breath. "You think you're going to do better? Shot of 4,000 meters isn't a gym lift." Ross didn't move at first. He simply let the weapon reports from earlier echo in his mind. He had watched each attempt, studied the wind, the dust plumes, the muzzle jumps, the way the mirage bent light along the valley floor. When he finally spoke again, his voice was low and even. "Let me do it." Head snapped toward him. The colonel raised a brow. "You? You're not even on the sniper roster for this cycle. I know. And yet you think you can hit that?" The colonel's tone shifted, irritated. Men with years of precision training missed wide. Ross didn't blink. "Let me do it." Something in his tone, calm, unshakable, grounded, carved a path through the tension. The instructors exchanged glances. One muttered, "Let him try. Worst case, he misses like the rest." The colonel sighed. "Fine. Give him the platform. One attempt. If you miss, we're done here." Ross walked forward, rolling his shoulders once, muscles shifting under his tan combat shirt. His boots pressed into the sand with a deliberate, powerful stillness. He settled behind the rifle, a weapon the others treated like a beast too wild to tame. He didn't call for spotters, didn't ask for wind readings, didn't request adjustments. He simply shouldered the rifle with a familiarity that made the instructors suddenly, unexpectedly quiet. As his eye met the scope, the world around him narrowed into a thin, perfect line. The desert pulse slowed. The wind whispered its pattern. The distance no longer looked impossible. He breathed out once, steady, slow, controlled. Ross Calder was finally ready to show them why silence is sometimes the strongest voice a man can have. Because when Ross pulled the trigger, it wasn't just the shot that stunned everyone. What happened immediately afterward changed the entire tone of the mission and exposed a truth no one on that range was prepared to face. The trigger broke cleaner than glass. For a moment, the Black Mesa Range held its breath. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the desert wind seemed to pause as though it wanted to witness the outcome. A full 5 seconds passed. Then, a faint metallic ping carried across nearly 2.5 miles of shimmering air, echoed back to the firing line. It was unmistakable. Ross Calder had hit the 4,000-meter target. The instructor's expressions froze in place. First confusion, then disbelief, and finally a rising shock that tightened every face along the range. Someone whispered, "No way." Another soldier leaned forward, squinting at the target camera feed. That was dead center. Ross didn't lift his head from the rifle immediately. He breathed once more, calm and controlled, as if grounding himself after pulling a thread tied to years of discipline. When he finally sat back, he didn't smile or boast. He simply stood, dusted his hands, and stepped away from the firing platform. The colonel's jaw worked up and down before words finally caught up to him. How did you do that without a spotter?" Ross shrugged gently. "I watched the others." A ripple of murmurs passed through the group. The other snipers, elite, confident, often louder than necessary, shifted uneasily. For the first time that morning, they studied Ross instead of ignoring him. But the colonel wasn't satisfied with a simple answer. "That distance requires wind calls, mirage readings, precise barrel timing." Ross looked toward the vast open desert. "The range tells you everything you need, if you listen." There was no arrogance in his tone, just truth. Quiet, steady, hard-earned. The colonel opened his mouth to challenge him again, but something else caught his attention. A junior instructor jogged over, pale and holding a tablet. "Sir, you need to see this." He turned the screen toward the colonel. A live drone feed displayed the target area. Or rather, what used to be the target area. The steel plate hadn't just been hit. It had been split along a welded seam. Ross's shot had torn through the structural weakness and nearly sheared the target in half. The colonel blinked rapidly. "That shouldn't be possible." Ross said nothing. A senior sniper stepped forward, rubbing the back of his neck. "Sir, with respect, that shot wasn't luck." Another added, "That's the kind of accuracy you hear about in stories. Urban legends, not something you watch happen in front of you." Ross took a slow breath. He hadn't come here to prove anything. Not to them, not to himself. He'd come because he'd been assigned to a quiet observation role for the day, and letting a dozen men fail while he stood back had felt wrong. But he also understood something else, something deeper. This shot was going to bring attention. Attention he did not want, and attention from the wrong people often came with consequences. The colonel finally stepped forward. "Calder, what's your background?" Ross paused. "Navy SEAL. 15 years. The colonel nodded slowly. "Your file says you specialized in maritime interdiction and breaching. Nothing about long-range precision." Ross's eyes flickered just briefly, something only a trained observer might catch. "My file is incomplete." "Incomplete?" the colonel echoed. Ross didn't elaborate. For the first time, the colonel truly studied him. Not the quiet man who kept to himself at the rear of formations, but the man who just made a shot that defied logic, training, and the expectations of everyone present. Before he could ask more, a voice cut across the range. "Sir, we have incoming from command. They want a full report immediately." The colonel stiffened. Ross's stomach tightened, not visibly but internally, like a knot he'd hoped would never be pulled again. High command never called for routine training outcomes, which meant someone somewhere had seen his shot. Someone who shouldn't have known his name. Someone who shouldn't have reason to remember him. And someone who had every reason to hide what Ross Calder was truly capable of. The colonel looked around sharply. "Calder, stay on standby. I may need you for questioning." Ross gave a brief nod, but his mind was already running through scenarios. He knew exactly what was happening. The shot hadn't just exposed his skill, it had exposed him. Because there were things in Ross's past that certain agencies preferred buried, sealed, and forgotten. And that perfect shot, it had just cracked the lid open. Because within the hour, a black SUV would arrive at the range carrying someone Ross hoped he would never see again. Someone who knew exactly what secrets his quiet hands had once carried. The sun had climbed higher by the time the dust plume appeared on the far road. Small at first, then unmistakable. The kind of vehicle that didn't belong on a routine training day. Soldiers nearby paused, some lowering binoculars, others exchanging uncertain glances. A matte black SUV rolled toward the firing platform, engine rumbling low and deliberate. No military markings, no plates. Windows tinted darker than standard regulations. It stopped beside the command tent with a hiss of breaking gravel. Ross Calder watched from a distance, jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. He knew that vehicle. He knew that silence. He knew that presence before a single door opened. Two men stepped out, suits clean-shaven, sunglasses reflecting the desert. They scanned the range like predators scenting old tracks, and from the back seat emerged the one person Ross had hoped had forgotten him. Director Alistair Grant, a man with the polished calm of someone who never raised his voice because he never needed to. The kind of man who spoke softly while signing off missions no one admitted existed. Grant adjusted his tie against the desert heat and walked toward the colonel with patient, measured steps. The colonel stiffened. "Director Grant, we weren't expecting any visitors from your office." Grant offered a controlled, thin smile. "I was notified of an interesting development this morning. A shot was made here that should not have been possible." The colonel swallowed. "Yes, sir. Ross Calder—" Grant cut him off with a gentle wave of his hand. "I know who Ross Calder is." The words hung in the air like a shadow. Ross stayed still, arms folded, boots planted in the sand, but internally old instincts flickered awake, sharp as the edge of a blade. Memories he had sealed away pressed faintly behind his ribs. Dark corridors, silent insertions, objectives without names. The colonel cleared his throat. "Director Oza, with respect, Calder is just— nothing about Ross Calder is just anything." The suits flanked Grant subtly, forming a quiet wall of authority as Grant's eyes finally settled on Ross across the range. "Bring him to me." Ross did not wait to be summoned. He stepped forward, every motion calm, controlled, powerful, muscles shifting beneath the tan shirt, casting short shadows on his forearms. The closer he came, the more the surrounding soldiers stepped back as though feeling an unseen tension rise through the heat. Grant studied him with the familiarity of someone who had once known him well. "Calder, it's been years." Ross's voice remained steady. "Director, you've been keeping a low profile. I prefer it." Grant gave a small, cool smile. "Yet here you are, splitting a 4,000-meter steel plate like it was a standard range target. You always had a talent for breaking things people said were unbreakable." Ross didn't respond. The colonel looked between them, trying to piece together what none of the files explained. "Director Grant, is there something we should know?" Grant clasped his hands behind his back. "Years ago, Calder worked under a classified assignment, off-record, deep capability testing. His skills were misinterpreted as liabilities by certain departments. There were disagreements." Ross's eyes hardened just slightly. Grant continued smoothly. "His departure from that program was not approved by everyone. Some of us preferred he remain available." The colonel felt his throat go dry. "Sir, are you saying Calder is tied to black budget operations?" Grant offered a polite, empty smile. "Colonel, the fewer questions you ask, the longer you'll sleep at night." Ross shifted subtly. "Why are you here?" Grant's expression sharpened. "Because that shot you made this morning awakened files that were meant to stay dormant. And certain individuals in Washington want to know if your skill set is still intact." Ross felt heat rise beneath his sternum. Not anger, not fear, but the cold return of a life he thought he'd buried in desert sand far from home. "I'm not going back," Ross said quietly. Grant's smile never broke. "You may not have a choice." Ross stepped closer, his shadow overlapping Grant's. "I'm not the man I used to be." "No," Grant replied, voice smooth as desert dusk. "You're stronger, and that makes you more of an asset than ever." The colonel could feel the tension like static electricity in the air. Ross kept his voice low, controlled. "Why does my shot matter to them?" Grant's answer was simple. Too simple. "Because someone else made a similar shot 2 months ago, on foreign soil, and sources suggest they trained with the same techniques you once developed." Ross's heartbeat slowed. His breathing deepened. His mind locked onto a single thought. Someone out there was using skills that were never meant to escape the shadows. Grant leaned in slightly, voice dropping. "We need to know who they are, and where they learned to shoot like you." The desert wind picked up, grainy sand brushing along their boots. Ross didn't respond. He didn't need to. His silence said more than any words, because what Director Grant revealed next, about Ross's past, about the shooter overseas, and about the connection no one saw coming, would force Ross to confront a ghost he never believed he'd face again. The colonel dismissed the surrounding soldiers, but none of them moved far. Curiosity held them in orbit around Ross and the man who had arrived like a shadow wearing a tie. Director Alistair Grant stood with the stillness of someone who thrived in uncomfortable spaces, someone who fed on secrets the way other men fed on sunlight. Grant adjusted the cuffs of his suit and spoke with quiet precision. The shooter overseas, the one who replicated your pattern, didn't just hit an impossible distance. They did it under pressure in terrain far less forgiving than this. Ross didn't flinch. You think it's someone I trained? Grant gave a thin smile. Not think, no. A cold, slow heaviness settled in Ross's chest. There were only a handful of people in his former program who had the raw instinct required to take a shot like that. Even fewer who could match his rhythm, his breath pattern, his ability to interpret wind like a second language. Ross's jaw tightened. Who? Grant turned slightly toward the desert horizon as though the name itself belonged out there. Far. Unreachable. A former teammate. Someone who disappeared off the radar before your final deployment. Someone who should not be alive. Ross felt his muscles coil involuntarily. A reflex from years of training. Years of surviving situations no one else walked away from. Don't play games, Ross said, voice low. Grant met his eyes. Her name was Lisa Keene. The world narrowed. The desert blurred. A pulse of memory slammed into him like a charging bull. Lisa Keene. Sharp-eyed, precise, a natural-born shooter who matched him beat for beat. She had vanished during an off-record operation, presumed dead in a collapse overseas. Ross had watched the shaky surveillance footage, recognized her silhouette disappearing into smoke and rubble. He had carried that ghost for years without speaking her name. She's dead, Ross said quietly. Grant shook his head once, almost gently. The footage was doctored. She wasn't killed. She was taken. Ross's breath stalled. A muscle in his forearm twitched, veins pushing against skin as he tried to process the impossible. Taken by who? Grant's silence was answer enough. Ross stepped closer, powerful frame casting a shadow across the director's polished shoes. Why are you telling me this now? Because whoever controls her now is deploying marksmen who use your methods. Someone with access to the same techniques you two mastered. They're reproducing your pattern with absolute precision. Ross's voice sharpened. That doesn't answer why you've come to me. Grant clasped his hands behind him. Because we believe the shot overseas was a message. To me? To anyone who knows what you are capable of, Grant replied. It was a demonstration, a challenge, or a warning. Ross stared at the ground for a long moment. Sand grains kicked lightly in the breeze, settling on the leather of his boots. He remembered Lisa's laugh, short, rare, earned. He remembered her stillness on a firing line, the way she could read heat-distorted air like music. He remembered believing she died with a calm expression because she trusted him to finish the mission. The idea of her being alive, controlled, directed, twisted into something weaponized, felt like a fist closing around his lungs. The colonel shifted uncomfortably. Director, this is beyond the scope of what we do at this range. Grant didn't even look at him. Colonel, everything is beyond your scope today. Ross finally spoke, voice steady but heavier than before. What do you want from me? To bring her back, Grant said softly. Or stop her. Ross's shoulders tensed. You expect me to hunt someone I once called a teammate? I expect you, Grant replied, to face the truth you've avoided for almost a decade. Ross's silence deepened. Grant continued, tone sharpening. She didn't vanish by accident. Someone used your program's collapse as cover. They took her because they wanted the best. And when she refused whatever they planned, they made sure you thought she died. Ross turned slightly away, staring at the jagged ridge in the distance. The desert heat shimmered like a mirage around him, distorting the horizon. He flexed his fingers once, scarred knuckles tightening, veins rising under sun-browned skin. He had spent years trying to bury the man he used to be. Years avoiding the ghosts. Years pretending certain memories belonged to someone else. But the shot he made that morning had woken everything up again. Grant stepped closer. Ross, you were always the anchor of that team. If she survived, if she's truly alive, she won't come after strangers. She'll come after the one person she remembers. Ross closed his eyes for a heartbeat. He didn't want to believe it, didn't want to resurrect the past he had buried, but the truth was simple and vicious. If Lisa Keene was alive, she would find him. Because before Ross could decide whether to walk away or confront the past, a transmission crackled. Through the base, one that confirmed Lisa wasn't just alive. She was already on U.S. soil, and her next target was far closer than anyone imagined. The radio static hit the command tent like a lightning strike. A communications tech sprinted out into the sunlight, headset askew, voice shaking as he called for the colonel. Ross turned instinctively, muscles tightening beneath his shirt as the urgency cut through the desert heat. "Sir, you need to hear this," the tech said, breathless. He handed the colonel the headset. The colonel listened for only a few seconds before his expression fell into a grim, pale stillness. He lowered the headset slowly, eyes shifting toward Ross with a look that carried both confusion and fear. "What is it?" Ross asked. The colonel swallowed. "There was a breach at the Sierra Crest facility outside Phoenix, one of our high-security research sites. A long-range precision device was stolen, and the intruder left something behind." Grant stepped closer, voice suddenly cool and razor-sharp. "What exactly?" The colonel hesitated. "A shot grouping on the wall." Ross's blood ran cold. Not because a shot grouping existed, but because the colonel's voice cracked when he added, "It matched Calder's exact pattern. Down to the millimeter." Ross exhaled slowly. A deep, steady breath that tried and failed to reach the bottom of his lungs. Grant's eyes gleamed with something between triumph and dread. "She's letting us know she's here." Ross shook his head. "No, that's not her style. Lisa never left signatures." "She's not the same person you once knew," Grant replied. "Whoever controls her now, whoever broke her, they turned her into a message." Ross stepped back a fraction, a shadow falling across his broad shoulders. He felt the desert around him closing in, the air tightening. His past was no longer creeping toward him, it was sprinting. The colonel's radio crackled again. "Sir, we have security footage, sending it to your tablet." The colonel tapped rapidly. Then he froze, breath catching. He turned the screen toward Ross. It wasn't Lisa's face, not fully, just a partial profile. A shadow slipping through a hallway like a ghost, but the silhouette, the posture, the precision of her movement. Ross felt his stomach twist. It was her, it had to be her, and yet something in the way she moved, sharp, mechanical, hollow, made a chill race across Ross's spine. This wasn't the teammate he remembered. This was a weapon wearing her shape. Grant placed a hand on the colonel's shoulder. "We need to move. Now." Ross stepped forward. "Where is she going?" Grant didn't hesitate. "Wherever she learned about you. Every sealed file, every buried operation, every piece of evidence that says you existed." Ross's jaw clenched. "She's trying to erase me. Or provoke you," Grant countered. Ross's hands curled into fists. A pulse of anger, hot, controlled, deadly, moved through him like a muscle memory he thought he'd lost. The colonel cleared his throat. "Director Grant, what do you want Calder to do?" Before Grant could answer, Ross spoke first. "I'm not hunting her." Grant raised an eyebrow. "You might have to." "No." Ross's voice was a rumble of quiet thunder. "If she's alive, she's been in survival mode for years. She doesn't even know who she really is anymore." Grant stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Ross, listen to me. Whoever reprogrammed her will use your connection against you. They know you won't pull the trigger on her. That makes her unpredictable and extremely dangerous." Ross held Grant's stare, shoulders squared, eyes steady. "Then I won't approach her as a target." "How will you approach her?" Grant asked. "As someone who refuses to abandon her again." The colonel blinked. Even the suits behind Grant glanced at each other. Ross had always been quiet, always been unreadable. But in that moment, a different force radiated from him. Something old, something unbroken, something powerful enough to bend the outcome of whatever was coming. The radio crackled one more time. "Sir, more intel coming through. Satellite feed from the breach is showing a directional trail. Looks like she's heading north, toward the outskirts of Mesa." Ross's eyes lifted. Mesa, a city he once trained in. A city where an old armory still held sealed crates tied to their former program. a city where ghosts waited in locked rooms. Grant exhaled sharply. She's going after the archives. Ross shook his head. No, she's going after the truth. The wind shifted suddenly, sending a swirl of desert dust around Ross's boots. Heat waves rippled in the distance like something alive, and Ross Calder understood what he had to do. He couldn't run from this, couldn't bury it, couldn't pretend that his past was dead. Not when someone he once trusted with his life was being used as a shadow aimed directly at him. Ross turned toward the parking area. Grant called after him. "Where are you going?" Ross didn't look back. To stop whoever turned her into this. Because when Ross finally reached Mesa, he didn't find a battlefield waiting for him. He found a message left by Lisa herself, one that proved she wasn't just alive. She was reaching out to him. Night fell over Mesa with the kind of desert stillness that made every sound carry twice as far. Ross Calder parked outside the abandoned armory, a long-forgotten structure built from rusted steel and sun-faded concrete, once used for classified training exercises before being sealed off from the world. A chain-link fence leaned tiredly around the property, cut cleanly in one place. The cut line was surgical, precise, unmistakable. Ross slipped through the opening, his boots crunching softly over the gravel. Moonlight glinted off the edges of his forearms, highlighting the scars and corded veins that ran like raised lines of history beneath his skin. He approached the armory's side door. It was unlocked, not forced, not broken, left open. For him, Ross pushed the door gently. Hinges groaned in protest as the stale smell of dust and old metal drifted out. Rows of storage crates sat in the shadows, draped under pale cloths. Overhead lights flickered weakly, powered by a failing backup generator. He stepped inside and saw the message. On the far wall, illuminated by a flickering bulb, was a single bullet hole. Dead center on a faded training poster he and Lisa once used for unconventional drills. Beneath it, carved into the wall with the edge of a knife, were two words. "I'm here." Ross exhaled, a breath that carried years of buried grief and unspoken memory. She wasn't running. She wasn't hiding. She was calling to him. He moved deeper into the armory, following a faint trail of footprints that led toward the far exit. She was close, maybe minutes ahead. His heart pounded with a surge of emotions he rarely let surface. He pushed open the back door. Cold desert night washed over him, and standing at the edge of the floodlights, part shadow, part moonlight, was a silhouette he recognized instantly. Lisa. She stood still, facing him, half-turned so her profile was visible. Her breathing was steady, but the tension in her shoulders told a different story. She wore tactical clothing unfamiliar to him, stitched with patterns that didn't belong to any U.S. program. Her hair was longer now, pulled back loosely. Her posture was identical to the one he'd memorized years ago. But her eyes carried something fractured, like glass that had been shattered and reassembled. Ross stepped forward, slow, deliberate. "Lisa." She didn't answer, didn't run, didn't aim a weapon, didn't even shift her weight. She simply watched him. When her voice finally came, it was quieter than he remembered. Hoarse, tired, human. "You weren't supposed to see me again." Ross swallowed against the ache in his throat. "They told me you were gone." "I was." Her gaze flickered toward the armory. "They made sure of it." Ross took another step. His massive frame cast a long shadow behind him, but his presence felt grounding, not threatening. "Who took you?" Ross asked. Lisa glanced downward, jaw tightening. "People who wanted something from me. Something I didn't want to give. When I refused, they broke what they could and rebuilt what they wanted." Ross's hands flexed subconsciously, veins rising. "You're not broken," he said quietly. For the first time, her eyes lifted fully to meet his. There it was, the recognition, buried under layers of conditioning, pain, manipulation, but alive. "I saw your shot today," she whispered. "I knew it was you." "Why leave a message?" Ross asked. Lisa hesitated. "Because if I approached you directly, they would see, and they would kill you." Ross shook his head. "Let them try." A tiny, fragile smile flickered at the corner of her mouth. "Gone as quickly as it came. Always the stubborn one," she murmured. Ross stepped until he stood mere feet away, desert wind brushing past them. "Come with me," he said softly. "We can fix this. We can take back your life." Lisa's eyes glistened, not with fear, but with something deeper, something old. "They're watching," she whispered. "Right now. They'll send someone for me." Ross squared his shoulders. "Then they'll have to go through me." The wind shifted again, carrying a trail of sand between them. Lisa closed her eyes briefly, as if deciding whether she had enough strength left to believe him. When she opened them again, there was clarity. "I don't want to run anymore," she said. "Then don't," he replied. A single tear slipped down her cheek, catching the moonlight before falling into the dust. "Ross, I don't know how to be myself again." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, but she didn't. His fingertips brushed her forearm, grounding her in a way nothing else had. "You don't have to know," he said quietly. "You just have to trust me." Lisa inhaled shakily, and then, for the first time in almost a decade, she stepped toward him, not as a weapon, not as a ghost, but as the person he had once protected. Ross wrapped an arm gently around her, powerful yet careful, as though holding something priceless but fragile. The desert night cooled around them. The world didn't change, but the path forward did. A path where Ross would face whatever shadows hunted her, and where Lisa would not face them alone. And if you've been listening this far, subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments what time it is where you're watching from. It helps more than you know.